thank you all so much for joining us for a look at Buddhist art expressions of piety. By various estimates, nearly 10% of the world's population is Buddhist. From its historical beginnings in the 6th century BCE India to its everyday appearance in our modern lives, like yoga and mindfulness, followers of Buddhism have created pieces expressing the religion's principles and for use by the faithful in worship. As Buddhism spread and changed, so too has the way its art looks. In this talk, we will begin to learn how to interpret the iconography of those images. The religion and images have developed and changed over centuries as it spread from India to China, Korea, Japan, and beyond. We will also shine a light on one of the greatest collections of Buddhist art from Japan, which is now a part of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. So hopefully I didn't butcher that, Mary. This talk is led by art historian Mary Woodward, who serves as a guide at several historic New England properties. She previously served as public programs coordinator and educator at the Concord Museum. Mary has a BA in art history from Furman University and an MA in art history from Emory University. She has 40+ years of experience in museums of all shapes and sizes, from the comprehensive collection at the Cleveland Museum of Art to the one-room log cabin birthplace of President James K. Polk. So we again thank the Corning Foundation and the Friends of the Library for sponsoring. Sorry, we were starting a few minutes late, but we'll go over by a few minutes. So everyone, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mary for joining us this morning. And Mary, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Robert and the Friends of Tewksbury Library. And thank you all for joining us today as we look at Buddhist art. We're going to start our story with the story of the historical Buddha, the Buddha of the present time, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama, who was born in India about 560 BCE, or before Common Era, and died 80 years later in 480 BCE. Just as a reference across cultures, those years correspond to the period we call the Golden Age of Greece. So if you were with me last talk, we were talking about Greece. We're going to look at his life through depictions in art, but be aware as we do it, for most of the time we're talking today, these images were made hundreds of years after he died. That's because the earliest forms of Buddhist art did not portray Buddha at all. So we'll talk about that as we go along. The practices and the art can differ wildly as Buddhism spread around the world, but it can also seem very similar to one another. So we're going to learn about the iconography, the signs and symbols associated with Buddhism. So in about 560 BCE, as I said, Siddhartha Gautama was born to Queen Maya, the chief wife of the ruler named Suddhodana. He was the ruler of a small border state in the area of what's now between India and Nepal. Before his birth, his mother dreamt of a white elephant. That was a symbol of royal greatness, and it was a good omen for her child's superiority. Queen Maya traveled to her hometown of Lumbini in present-day Nepal, and as the art depicts, she gave birth to Siddhartha while standing. She's standing and holding onto a branch over a tree over her head that sort of leans down and offers its support to her. The baby Siddhartha emerges from her right side, and he's pictured again just below, standing on a flower pedestal, getting his first bath. I want you to look at that beautiful S-curve and sinuous form that his mother's body takes, because we're going to see it again, and we're going to understand the iconography involved in picturing her that way. Now, Siddhartha was raised in his father's palace, surrounded by great wealth. He's sometimes referred to as the lion of the Shakya clan. And another name for him is Shakyamuni, which translates as the sage of the Shakya. His father tried to isolate Siddhartha from the suffering in the world, since it had been predicted that Siddhartha would either be a king or a wandering religious man. Obviously, Dad was hoping for the former, and of course, it doesn't work out that way. But young Siddhartha does grow up in the palace, and he is sheltered. He doesn't know about old age or sickness or death. He never sees any of that. But eventually he leaves the palace and he sees four sights. He sees an old person. He sees a sick man. He sees a corpse at a funeral and a wandering ascetic, a person who practices self-denial, often for religious reasons. So Siddhartha's eyes were opened. He leaves home, the story goes, the same day that his wife gives birth. Some scholars think it was a slightly different time period, but either way, as a young man, he separates himself now from his family, and he spends 6 years wandering, starving, and denying himself as he seeks knowledge. After those 6 years, he decides to abandon such excesses, and he's resolved to follow the middle way, a path of moderation, which rejects stimulation, wild stimulation, but also mortification. And so what we see is that Siddhartha chooses to sit under a tree, the Bodhi tree, to meditate. He sits there for 49 days. And while he's there, he's tempted by evil. In this beautiful little ivory piece, and you can see that it's curved because it's made out of an ivory tusk, we see an important detail in the iconography of Buddhism. Siddhartha reaches down and touches or reaches towards the ground. The ground answers with a shudder, and it sends the demons and the things that were tempting him away in fear. And you can see his hand reaching down. Hand positions, hand gestures are called mudra in Buddhism, and they're very, very important because they each have messages that they want to add to the image. So this is the message of touching the earth. This is Siddhartha doing that. He sits under the tree and he meditates until he reaches enlightenment, which pretty much could be described as the cessation of desire, no longer have desires. He meditates night and day, and he learns about his past lives. He learns about reality, and in the morning, there's a big jolt of the earth, and it's said to be like a lion's roar, and it announces his victory. He's broken the cycle of rebirth, samsara, the cycle of rebirth. He has now reached enlightenment. He's the Buddha. He is the awakened one. He is the enlightened one. Now, the place that this occurred is called Bodh Gaya, and here, and it's now often referred to as the seat of enlightenment. It became a pilgrimage spot in Buddha's life and for his followers, and it still is. There's a tree growing there, which is descended from the original Bodhi tree, and it's considered a living relic of Buddha. Now, it's easy to understand this depiction of the kind of what happens next. Buddha is seated in a deer park, and you see the deer down at his feet in the town or city of Sarnath. He sits with 5 followers, we'll do the math in a minute, who had been ascetics with him. They had been taking that strenuous path of self-denial, but they fell out with him when he decided that moderation was the better path. Nevertheless, they gather around Buddha to hear him and listen to him. And as they do, their minds are changed. They see that he is enlightened. You see, he has a halo or a mandorla behind his head and sort of flames of enlightenment, light streaming out from behind his head. His right hand is turning the wheel, and he's setting that wheel in motion forever. He's radiating the Dharma, the teaching of Buddhism, and it's spreads out in every direction like the spokes of a wheel. The wheel becomes a symbol for that teaching of Buddha. The ascetics, the 5 followers around him, decide to follow him. They shave their heads, as you can see. They get monks' robes on, and they travel throughout in every direction to spread the word, eventually founding Buddhist monasteries. Now, there is a 6th figure. I can count 2. You spotted it. There's a 6th figure in this piece, and that's Vajrapani. He's not, and he's holding a thunderbolt in his hand. He's not in the original telling of the story, but artists added him later, a sort of extra protection for Buddha. But we want to look at the way that Vajrapani is represented because it's important. Look at his curly hair. Look at his physique. Even though he's tiny in this image, he's got muscles there, doesn't he? The artist is drawing on Western imagery from the Greek and Roman world that had made its way into Northwest India. So that curly hair reminds us of Greco-Roman characters like Hercules, or even the real person, Alexander the Great. From this point on, Buddha lives, after his enlightenment, he lives 45 more years. When he knew that his death was near at the age of 80, he laid down on his right side, went into a trance, and died. With that, he broke the cycle of the rebirth and he entered nirvana. And nirvana is a Sanskrit word meaning something like a flame blown out in the wind. Now, as I mentioned at first, the human form of Buddha wasn't used in Buddhist art for hundreds of years after his death. Those things we just saw were done a little bit later than that. Buddha insisted that he was not a god and therefore he shouldn't be worshipped. So symbols stood in for him. This is called aniconic representation. And you get things like the Dharma wheel with its 8 spokes for the 8-fold path, or you get the deer standing in for Buddha and his teachings in the park, or footprints, as you see here with the multi-spoked wheel on the bottom of the foot. Recently, this idea of aniconic, that these are images in place of Buddha, has been challenged by some scholars who suggest that no, these are relics, and people are venerating those relics. But I believe that it is the first description, that these are standing in for Buddha because they have yet to decide if they're going to actually represent the Buddha, Shakyamuni, as he was a human on this planet. Now, footprints is a fun way because here at Boston's MFA, there's a big slab carved in limestone, and the representation, the label says this is an image of Buddha bathing in a river. And you might think that that would be Buddha there in the center of the left-hand panel with the big headdress on and all, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that. But that's not where Buddha is in this image. Buddha represented only by his footprints, and I've put a detail there over to the side. Now, after Buddha's death, his body was cremated, and his ashes and other relics and remains were gathered and placed in reliquaries. First, there were just 8 from the 8 major places that were important in Buddha's life, but then the relics were divided into many, many thousands of more pieces, and they were placed in tiny containers like this one. It's a tiny reliquary which holds the remains or relics associated with Buddha, and those are considered sacred and powerful. Reliquaries were often made of precious materials like gold and crystal and precious stones and pearls, shiny and reflective things. This one is made of stone, but the knob is gilded, and even though it's faded now, inside, which is why I show you a slide of the inside was gilded as well. That shiny and reflective quality references the light of Buddha's embodiment. So this little vessel is shaped like a cosmetics vessel. In ancient times, the people used perfume in India in the form of aromatic pastes. And it was said that the enlightened Buddha, as he went around for the next the last 45 years of his life, smelled like sandalwood. So the reliquary here takes the form of a perfume bottle and kind of references that physical aspect of the enlightened Buddha. Reliquaries like this little one were placed inside large mounds called stupas. Buddhism spread in India, helped along by its simple teachings and also by a particular ruler in the 200s BCE named Ashoka. Ashoka established tens of thousands of relic stupas across Asia. How could he do that? Well, he ruled for 40 years over a kingdom of 30 million people, most of them within India. And he found that a way to unify his different people, all these different peoples, and a way to amend his previously warring ways was to turn to Buddhism, which he did in the year 261 BCE. So just a few hundred years really after Buddha's death. Ashoka had his beliefs written down, and he decided to set an example, quote, of noble living in nonviolence and kindness to all beings. So this is the stupa at the city of Sanchi, built in the 200s, as you see, and then continually added onto. Devotees came here and were meant to walk up the ramps or steps and walk in circular paths around the structure, but there was no interior. The relic is in the interior. For the most part, the relics were kept deep inside the stupa. There's no interior for them to visit. The process is part of going through the gate and walking. The gate, by the way, let me show you a detail of it. The gate here at Sanchi features numerous animal and plant material representations, and iconic references to Buddha, because we're not seeing Buddha himself yet. But we do start to see the first large-scale human figures. So look at your lower right there. You see that woman holding up the sort of as a point of a bracket there, a part of the lintel. And here's another one, a gateway bracket. Goddesses of fertility would have been important in pre-Buddhist cultures because fertility was everything, wasn't it? Your family to survive, your agriculture to survive, it was important. And so it's not surprising that some of the first large-scale representations of human figures in Buddhist art appear on the railings and the stupas, and they take the form of these exuberant nature goddesses and local deities. The women were Yakshi, called Yakshi, and they were idealized, they were voluminous. But look what she's doing with her hand. She's reaching up and grabbing a branch over her head. As she touches it, because she's the fertility goddess, the branch, the tree blossoms, it flowers, it fruits. So this type of figure, this fertility deity, lends her form to the representation of Siddhartha's mother, which we saw earlier, but in time was created several hundred years later than this piece right here. So this is why Siddhartha's mother looks like a fertility goddess. They were using that iconography. Buddhism absorbs those pre-existing fertility symbols and images and recreates them as their own, if you will. So it's still in this period of early Buddhist art in the first few centuries after his life and death that we're still not seeing the actual Buddha. But we begin to see more and more symbols that are important and in use for thousands of years. The lotus flower is one of them. We know the lotus flower grows in mud and it grows through dirty water before rising and blooming. And that's symbolic of Buddha's path through life to enlightenment. Later, as we'll see in just a second, Buddha's often pictured sitting on a big lotus blossom, signifying both his enlightenment and purity. This fragment with two lotuses or several superimposed on one another was part of a stupa railing. And it also features twisted braided vines, a whole world of nature there. But I've put a yellow arrow there at the bottom because it features this frieze of bells, musical bells. And I like that because it introduces the element of sound. And in real life, in the real use of these stupas, there would have been bells ringing in the wind, which is a lovely thought. Now, eventually, images of the Buddha himself began to be made. I'm going to quote from an author who just said it so beautifully. I'm going to quote from them, okay? The goals of these artists who were making these pieces wasn't personal expression. We think of art today as personal expression. That is not what drove Buddhist art. It was instead to create beautiful, faultless representation of Buddha. The concept of sponsoring art became the ambition of everyone, emperors, monks, the common person. And so depending upon how wealthy you were, a common person might make something out of clay or wood that might not last very long. And a ruler could do it out of marble, okay? But all of them desired to participate in this creation of image of Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. Now, according to Buddhist philosophy, as long as the representation that was created generated karmic merit, in other words, as long as it was being venerated, it could create good karma for the person who sponsored it, who commissioned it, and that could lead to a positive rebirth. So as long as the gift of art or image to the community was venerated, as long as it was considered and adored, looked at, there was merit being created for the patron who, in their lifetime, in this one, and in their next lifetime. So it could be a simple object or it could be a grand object. But in order to help the creator, it needed to be venerated. It needed to be shared with devoted public. So the first images of Buddha begin to appear in the 200s and 100s BCE. So basically about 200 years after his life. Seemingly begin really in the northern part of the country of India, where he was born and where he was active. And once it was started, then images of Buddha spread rapidly. Another author writes that the beautiful sculptures crossed linguistic and cultural boundaries to inspire and convert communities as Buddhism moved out of India. So as artists began to represent the Buddha, their styles differed from region to region around India. They shared the same iconography, the same symbols and signs. He wears monk's robes. He bears the urna, or the curl of hair between his eyes on his forehead. He also has the ushnisha, which is the bump on his head. It's sort of the embodiment of that enlightenment. Some people call it the extra big brain up there. He has the elongated earlobes stretched out from years of wearing heavy princely earrings, which he no longer wears as the Buddha. His eyes are usually somewhat downcast, sort of introspectively. You can get that feeling. And there are said to be 32 major characteristics of Buddha's physical presence that needed to be included or could be included in a sculpture. Now, when we look at these three, all from India, the differences are most apparent in the way the body is treated and how the japri is treated. In the area around Sarnath there, the cloth is nearly invisible on his body. He's wearing a monk's robe because you can see the collar around his neck, but it's so thin there in order to show us his perfectly formed figure. To those artists and creators, his bodily purity was a representation of his spiritual purity. The middle style is the style that shows the most influence from the Greco-Roman world to the west, and this comes from the Gandhara region, which is in the northwest region. In other words, the closest region to the Greek and Roman world, where they had a history of a relationship with the Hellenistic or Western world of Alexander the Great. He conquered the region in 331 BCE, and along with him brought the Greek culture and tradition of representing the human body in art to India. Features of Gandharan art that are seen for the first time here in sort of set the iconography across almost all the styles is that Buddha is seen wearing monastic robes. Now, a wandering monk might just wear threadbare rags, but Buddhas are not threadbare. He's wearing robes. The face of Buddha is usually full with this very calm and placid look to it. And typically the hair is wavy or curly and thick. Those become pretty standard iconographic features. Now, in the third one to consider on the right, in Mathura in central India, Buddha is portrayed in a more sensual way. His body, they're following a tradition of those earlier fleshy, fertile deities that we talked about. You get a sense of his soft, nude body under these tightly pulled robes, and he is also wearing a robe, even though we almost like looking through it in a way. The folds are stylized. Look at the ridges on his arm. Those are the very abstracted folds of his robe. So one thing that all these Buddhist images share is the important feature of the position of the hands, the mudra. There are meanings attached to these positions, and in this case, the right hand is up in a protection position, while the left hand is down in a position that reads as the power to grant a wish. Now, one of the most important ways that Buddhism spread was along trade routes, the land routes that made up the Silk Road, and you can just see some of them delineated in this map in green. And there were water routes as well, which you can judge are the ones dotted across the water. The Silk Road was at its peak in the first few centuries of the Common Era. It was 5,000 miles of routes connecting Rome in the west and China in the east, with lots of interesting stops along the way. I know it's hard for us to imagine, but that before our time, there was plenty of international trade and travel going on these vast networks of paths. They were taking traders and craftsmen and missionaries into these new lands. And there were untold amounts of goods passing hands: gold, silk, jade, porcelain, spices, wine, raw materials, back and forth. Untold amounts, as I said, and ideas were spreading along these east-west trade routes, styles, ideas, religions, and they would travel back and forth for centuries. Now, without getting too deeply into the theology, as Buddhism spread, different schools of Buddhism, different branches, if you will, if you see the chart there on the side of the map, different schools or branches develop. Part of the reason for this was that there never did exist a gospel, a written word that could be considered straight from the mouth of historical Buddha Shakyamuni. For centuries, his followers had passed his teachings along in an oral tradition. So there was no ancient text to serve as a definitive word in the first few centuries after his life and death. Instead, though, monks and scholars wrote and debated, and different schools began to develop. In addition to the varying schools or branches of thought and practice, the art changed as well. Another author says that while all Buddha images adhere to those earlier models, and I mentioned the iconography of the urna, ushnisha, that type of thing, they all attempt to show, each in their own way, a true and correct likeness. Countless generations of artists produced works that gradually were adapted to accommodate both emerging tastes and some of these changing ideologies. So in China, we see Buddhism arrive in the first century of the Common Era, and we see the rise in the building of monumental size images of Buddha. Here in the Shaanxi province, along the Silk Road or Silk Route, we see a site which encompasses ancient caves that contain tens of thousands of sculptures within them, all carved from the living rock. The one in the image here This monumental Buddha was made about 460 in the Common Era, so the year 460. It's a 40-foot high image of the Shakyamuni, and it was within a cave-like setting or a grotto setting, but the front of the rock fell apart, and so now it's exposed. One can see it without having to go inside a cave. The image of Buddha, one author notes, as it travels into China, becomes increasingly more formal and otherworldly. And they say this reflects a difference, a fundamental difference between the way the Chinese viewed their deities and the Indians had viewed their deities. Now, while the image of the Buddha Shakyamuni may become more conservative once it gets to China, something happened to the figure of Maitreya. Now, in Indian art, Maitreya was a studly prince. He was the Buddha of the future, and we'll speak about what that means in just a minute. But in China, he becomes this very overweight, big, jolly figure, often referred to as the laughing monk. This one is located in a shrine on the top of a mountain. It's made of tons of steel and covered in bronze, and the statue itself is about 150 feet high. Those people walking up the steps are friends of mine who visited, and it must have seemed like a very long walk up. But you can actually see this form of Buddha, of Maitreya, in shops around the world, really, where owners believe they hope he'll bring blessings of good business. In Japan, this figure gets translated into the big tummied Buddha that they call Hotai, and you may recognize that name. Now, before we leave the topic of monumental images in Central Asia, let's have a look at one more site that's famous for another reason. This was the monumental Buddha at Bamiyan in Afghanistan, made about 600 CE, Common Era. To create the 175-foot tall figure, they cut it away from the living rock to begin with, and they had added layers of clay to sculpt, as you see on the left there, and then it had been painted. But it was destroyed, as we know, in 2001 by the Taliban. Now, much closer to home, Boston. The Museum of Fine Arts has a world-renowned collection of Buddhist art. It just so happens that right now it's under renovation. And so stay tuned, opening summer sometime. I would recommend actually phoning the museum. If your main goal is to go and see the art of Japan, do telephone, because it's not that apparent on the website at present when it will be open. But the Boston's Museum of Fine Arts has a stunning history with its world-renowned collection, and it expands not just in the Japanese collection, but in the Chinese, in India, and Southeast Asian rooms as well. It was one of the earliest museums in the country to hire a curator of Chinese and Japanese art, a man named Okakura Kakuzo. In 1904, he was hired. Now, he was a good friend to two people that you might have been with me to talk about before, and that was Isabella Stewart Gardner in the white, sitting back there on the back row, and Henry Sleeper down here on the front right side. And there is Kakuzo with his friends. Now, at the MFA, interestingly enough, the label for this large figure, it's actually Bodhisattva. I'll talk about that in a second, but this large Buddhist figure, the label for it tells an interesting story that I want to share with you. Apparently, Kakuzo had seen this piece half buried on the grounds of the oldest Buddhist monastery in China when he visited in 1906. He tried to buy it from them at that time, but he was turned down. He came back to Boston and he lamented to his friends, probably one of the friends we just saw him sitting with, about the one that got away, the piece he wished he could have collected for the museum. Well, happily, the story turns, because after his death, the museum trustee spotted this figure for sale in a Paris antique shop. So somebody had been successful in buying it from the monastery. And this trustee bought it and gave it to the MFA in Boston as a gift in honor of Kakuzo. Now, as we continue with looking at the MFA's collection, let's mention this. Siddhartha, the Buddha of the present time, the Buddha that we followed in his life story, is considered to be the 24th Buddha in history. And so there grew, as Buddhism developed, there became a growing devotion to the many Buddhas, many different Buddhas, past, present, and future, to pay attention to and to admire. And another one of those important Buddhas was Amitabha, the Buddha of infinite light. He dwells in a paradise known as the Western Pure Land. The paradise is described this way as being full of sweet smells, clouds of music, showers of jewels, and every other beauty and joy. Sounds delightful. Amitabha, the Buddha of infinite light, saves all who believe and trust in him. Now, this altar, which also features an incense burner, was commissioned by 8 women of the same family clan in order to ensure their rebirths and those of their children, and going back into history, those of their ancestors. When the MFA was first given the piece in 1922, and let me go to a detail here. There we go. The lions and to either side in the front, the little figures at the edges where the green arrows are, and the little incense burner right in the middle were all gone off of the piece. They had been removed somewhere and sold elsewhere. But happily, 25 years after this piece came into the collection at the MFA, they were found and reunited with the altar, and they were given as a gift by the son of the original donors. So it's all together again. It was made, yes, you're right, in the year 593. 593. So another school of Buddhism is one, or we may have seen it on the map, may have caught your eye, Mahayana Buddhism. It's often referred to as the Great Vehicle. But simply put, in addition to representing the Buddhas, past, present, and future, there was an emphasis in this branch of Buddhism on bodhisattvas. They are enlightened beings. They are beings who have actually reached the stage of Buddhahood. But rather than going on to nirvana, they've chosen to remain here and stay behind to help others. And they're portrayed as royal figures, often with elaborate jewelry, versus the portrayals of Buddha, who may look very similar in face and shape and body, but who's dressed in monk's robes. So here's a pop quiz, Buddha or Bodhisattva. You see these all made in roughly the same time period, but you've only got Buddha in the middle, 2 bodhisattvas on either side. That's your pop quiz. And I gave you the answers. Okay, we're going to move to Japan as we finish up. During the 500s and 600s of the Common Era, Buddhism was introduced to Japan from Korea and China in that Mahayana form, which was with many Buddhas, past, present, future, and many venerated bodhisattvas. It was promoted, Buddhism was, by the imperial family, and it was adopted as a state religion. And it was popular for its meditation and for promise of enlightenment. A serene face, look at that, calm in an uncalm world. That's a perfect description for this depiction of the Amida Buddha at Kamakura. It's a bronze statue, but it was originally gilded, created, as you see, in 1253. He's 44 feet high, and he sits serenely with his hands in the mudra, or position of inner balance and meditation. This figure has withstood storms, even a tsunami that blew away the hall that was built around it to protect it. So ever since 1495, it's just been left in the open air. It's magnificent. Now, the art of the Kamakura period showed a new emphasis on realism. This is a wooden statue of the monk Kuya. He's depicted very realistically in his traveling clothes. He's got his gong, he's got a staff, and he's got 6 syllables of his chant shown literally as 6 tiny little Buddhas coming out of his mouth. He is chanting to Amida. He's saying, Namu Mida Butsu. I entrust myself to the Buddha of the infinite light and life. The version of this school of Buddhism maintained that just chanting this name of Amida Buddha would be enough to lead to rebirth. So this Buddha of the Western Pure Land, the Western Paradise, who saves all who trust and believe in him, was very, very, very popular. Now we're going to turn our last bit of attention to Zen Buddhism because it's the form most well known in popular culture here in the West. It's also characterized by the practice of meditation and by a somewhat irreverent and sometimes unpredictable teaching style. The teachings of Zen Buddhism often came from enlightened master priests. We hear Zen master mentioned often, not ancient texts or writings of philosophers, but of Zen Buddhists themselves. It's said that Zen actually originated during one of his sermons. Buddha answered a question posed to him by merely holding up a flower and smiling. Of everyone who was in attendance, only one disciple understood and was said to have immediately attained complete enlightenment. Zen uses meditation as a process of clearing the mind of everyday occurrences in order to find your self-realization. The Buddhist priests who taught followers often used riddles called koans, and the most famous is probably for you to consider what is the sound of one hand clapping. That's actually written by this man here, Hakuin, who was a great Zen master, a poet, and a painter. He's pictured here in a stunning self-portrait of broad and quick strokes with a wonderfully quizzical facial expression. And on the right, a painted landscape by another Buddhist priest, the artist named Sesshu. This was painted during the Muromachi time period. It follows the Kamakura. It's ink on paper in the form of a hanging scroll. This style is called haboku, which means flung ink, splashed ink. It looks quick and haphazard, but it's anything but that. Artists worked out very deliberately to how to vary the widths and the strengths of their inks and their lines and their shading, while retaining this very dreamy kind of impressionistic atmosphere. Sesshu was born into a samurai family and did become a Zen priest, as I said, but he was also a successful and internationally known artist during his time. And we'll finish up with one more Zen master. This is a wooden statue called Hoto Kokushi. That is actually a posthumous title that was given to this monk because the title means one who is perfectly awakened national teacher of the Dharma, of the teachings. It's made, by the way, of hinoki cypress wood, and that is fragrant. And so there's a connection back to India and the sandalwood associated with Buddha. Now, Zen temples were generally built outside of town in nature. For the monks and the priests and the followers, it was a life of self-reliance. They grew their own food, they cleaned their own temples. They're still maintaining their own rock gardens, as you see here. But that's unlike the way Buddhist monasteries worked in India, where the community supported the monastery. In Japan, in Zen Buddhism, they are meant to do it themselves. We'll end with a few beautiful pictures. Can't help myself. This is the World Heritage Site of Ryoanji Temple in Kyoto. This is the dry landscape garden. And it's said to have 15 rocks that you can't see all 15 at one time. You can see 14, but not 15. There are only two sides. Some of you may have been to it. There are only two sides viewing platform that you can see. It's a nice way to interpret it this way. And I think I'm not sure they're pondering these great truths. This was a bunch of school kids. Maybe they are. But one is meant to ponder one's own existence. Sometimes you're the big rock. You are standing immobile and the world moves out of your way, like the lines scraped in the gravel that give you a sense of water moving past. Sometimes you're the big rock. Eventually, you're going to be broken off and be one of the small pebbles in the stream. That's just how nature goes. Now, it seems that Buddhism is with us all over our lives today. Mindfulness, we talked about, the mental application of focusing to try to free yourself from the habitual ways that we respond to things. We all know what triggers us. Mindfulness would try to stress us, to show us how to move away from that repetitive, often negative behavior. And Buddha is in our everyday world. Manufacturers are busy making lots of images of Buddha for the Western world. Sometimes they get it right, like on the right, his hands are in the correct mudra. And sometimes, like on the left, they can't even spell his name right, but that's okay. I'm going to leave you with a poster, which I want you to read, and I'm going to read out loud. You should sit in nature for 20 minutes a day. Unless you're busy, then you should sit for an hour. All right, I'll stop there. And if you have any questions or comments, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Thank you.
So folks, let's give Mary a big virtual round of applause for her presentation. As she said, if you have any questions, put them into the Q&A. If you have any comments, put them into the chat. And we'll go for about 10 minutes here. Diane says, this was awesome. Thank you both very much. I learned so much.
Thank you.
Teresa, Teresa, the answer to your question is yes. Barb says, namaste, Mary and Robert. Quite an enlightening mid-morning. Many thanks for another lovely presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lisa says, this has been fantastic. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Janet says this was very informative. Dory says wonderful presentation as always. And she's throwing roses at you, I think.
Oh, good. Oh, I
think that's what that is.
Thank you.
I never quite know with the emojis what they're representing.
I don't even know how to make those. I like them though.
Yeah. Margaret says thank you. Patricia says wonderful. Anonymous attendee says you are so knowledgeable about so much art. And they're wondering if you have a particular style or type of art that you enjoy most.
I am a medievalist by training. So yes, medieval art, European medieval art, but even scooting back to Anglo-Saxon, Viking, yes. But, you know, it's just a joy. And I have been very, very fortunate to have a career where I get surrounded by art, and especially at the Cleveland Museum of Art, where they have such a comprehensive collection of art. You could 1 second walk in the armor court in medieval Europe, and then you flip around the corner and you would be in the Buddhist world of early India. So what a joy. Before we get into the question, I did want to say one thing about, I always like to try to let people know when something groovy is happening in the art world. And in addition to the MFA's Japanese Buddhist collection opening up sometime in the summer, but call first, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in a month from now is opening, as it happens, an exhibit called Tree and Serpent, Early Buddhism Art in India. Early Buddhist art, rather, in India. So that begins this July 21st at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Okay, it's a little ad.
Thanks for the plug. Anonymous attendee asks, and sorry if I missed this, but what does the OA on so many of the slides?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, now there's me trying to be complete. It stands for open access. which means that museums who used to not want you to use their images, like remember going to museums when they wouldn't let you take pictures? Most of them have changed all of that because they've decided, wait, we want to disseminate these images. So OA is just a way of letting you all know that I have the ability, I have the right, I'm sharing those pictures with those museums authority. If it's not there, it was me taking a picture for the most part, or I gave somebody else credit, but that's what it means, open access.
Jody says this was a great introduction to Buddhist art. June says, thank you for an interesting presentation. Kay says, thank you for this lovely presentation. Iris says, thank you, I learned so much. Eileen says she plans on attending the Japanese art exhibit at the MFA Boston.
Good. So it's part of their permanent exhibit when it reopens. If you, they said summer. It's summer yesterday, right? So do check first. They have a beautiful set of Buddhist sculptures well, they used to, and I think the new exhibit will as well, the new installation, set within a Buddhist temple-like space, which would be lovely, but you can't see them yet. So do check with the museum.
So Mary, an anonymous attendee, says that the Pittsburgh Science Center currently has an international touring exhibit on the Vikings.
Oh,
so
okay. Well,
you might want to try to visit.
Exactly. I vacation around museum exhibits. I do. Thank you for the plug. I will check that out. I could do that.
An anonymous attendee says, I got to see the Kamakura Buddha, and you can actually go inside of it,
Yes.
inside the back of the statue.
Yes, you can. I did too. I was 5 years old, so don't remember a lot. And I have desperately tried to find the picture of me. That would be cool. I can't find it, but yes, that's right. You can. It's hollow inside. You're right.
Diane says, besides the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where nearby can we see the art that you showed?
Well, you can see it at the Harvard Museums. Okay, you can go on the website and look at the Harvard Museums and see what parts of their collection are there. And let me see. I think that's the only next one that springs to mind, but correct me somebody if I've missed something in my brain.
And Diane notes that many of your slides have the initials CMA.
Yes,
so
I'm sorry. I was doing that kind of late last night. That stands for Cleveland Museum of Art.
Yeah.
So Cleveland Museum of Art has a huge Asian collection. And if you are anybody who has picked up any books on Asian art, most likely the main book is by Sherman Lee, and Sherman Lee was the director of the Museum of Art. I brought a couple more. Look here, this is the first Chinese object ever to enter Boston's MFA collection. And look at the date that it entered. It entered in 1878. So they've been interested in Asian art here in Boston in an official way for quite some time.
Joyce asks, does the Peabody Essex Museums have Buddhist art?
Of course. Well, they have a giant Chinese house, don't they? Thank you for reminding me. Yes.
And Jody wonders about the Worcester Museum of Art. What do you think?
Probably. It's a very comprehensive collection. It's like a mini Cleveland Museum of Art, and that's a big compliment for me. Worcester is a lovely collection. Anybody who wants to spend a fantastic day, I can't recommend it enough. And absolutely go on their website. Oh yeah, I know they do. I know they have Buddhist jades at the Worcester Museum, which are just gorgeous little sculptures from actual pieces of jade. They have all kinds of things, but not just Asian art. But yes, Worcester would be perfect. Peabody Essex, as I said, they have an entire Chinese house inside their museum, and it is cool. Yeah.
And Mary, we'll do a few more minutes because we started a few minutes late. Robin knows that the Met Show opens on July 21st, so that's in about a month.
That's right.
Osmena says, talking of medieval, do you have a presentation on Hildegard of Bingen and the wonderful work that she produced. We don't hear about her very much nowadays, except that she's a saint.
You're right, Hildegard von Bingen. At the Cleveland Museum of Art, I sound like a broken record. They had an enormous piece of cloth that was embroidered by Hildegard. Wow. No, I don't have a talk about her yet, but never say never. I get a lot of good ideas from people who make suggestions. So thank you. You're right. She's an unsung hero of the Middle Ages.
And I've lost the context for this question,
okay.
But at 11:03, so about 30 minutes ago, Mary, you showed a slide, and Benita asked, is the drapery he wears symbolic of Greek and Roman styles?
Yes. Yes. Do you want to go for some whiplash here? Hold on a sec. Let's zoom back. See how far I don't have to go to. Yeah, there we go. Well, let's just look at the one in the middle, because that's Buddha. But look, yes, you're absolutely right. So things that were made in Gandhara, in the region of the northwest of India, if you get your geography right, the northwest of India, the corner is going to be the corner closest to the Western world, closest to Western Europe. And that is where, as I said, Alexander the Great, in his great conquest to take over everything, was in India in 331, conquering that area. So what he did was he brought the culture. So you have things like that drapery and that fully developed body. All three of these are Gandharan pieces. We looked at them because it was two bodhisattvas and a Buddha in the middle. So the difference is the bodhisattvas are dressed like princes with beautiful jewels. But look at their realistically portrayed actual bodies, and then the realistic way that the drapery falls. Yes, that is a Western Greco-Roman influence. Yep.
All right, Mary, I think we're going to wrap it there. We've gotten to every question and comment.
Good.
So folks, let's give Mary another big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. Mary, I'll circle back to you in 1 second, but I just want to remind folks you'll receive an email from me tomorrow with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, Mary's references, information about our next 10 virtual art history programs. And as a reminder, folks, we're shifting temporarily our art history programs to Fridays in July and August. So instead of Thursday mornings, they're going to be on Friday mornings. But the vast majority of them will still be recorded in case you can't attend live. Also in that email will be information about the virtual summer reading program, which I'd love for you to all to participate in. You don't have to live in Tewksbury. You can live wherever. So Mary, do you have any last words for the audience before we wrap it up?
No, I don't. I just want to thank you, Robert, and thank Tewksbury Library and all of you for attending today. And may you have a peaceful and joyful day. Thank you.
All right. So Mary, thank you so much. Enjoy your summer, and we'll see you in August.
Yes, sir. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.